Welcome to day 2 of Olfaction. I hope you enjoy it as much as that little guy likes his flower. We're going to start today by talking about how olfactory information is coded in the brain and how this relates to the emotional power of smell. We ended last time at the olfactory bulbs, and we'll follow the path that the olfactory information takes from the olfactory bulb up to the brain. The olfactory pathway is different from other sensory pathways in a few notable ways. The first is that there is no relay in the thalamus. Every other sensory system, all of them, relays in the thalamus before going to higher order cortical processing. But not smell. Smell just plays by its own rules. So let's see how this strange system works. There are projections that go directly from olfactory bulb to piriform cortex. So this is primary olfactory cortex. It's the region where the basic processing of olfactory input occurs. So when you're saying, is it smoky, is it floral, and so forth. But as you read, there are also direct projections from the olfactory bulb to the amygdala, which is very important for emotion processing, and to entorhinal cortex, which has some important memory-related functions. So from there, information projects to other regions of the brain evolved in affective evaluation. So you may recall that the orbitofrontal cortex is also important in the gustation unit, one of the things that is coding for the affective evaluation of the stimuli. So do I like that smell or not? There are also projections that go to hypothalamus, which is important for managing basic drives and motivations, and other memory-related regions like the hippocampus. So I show this diagram to point out how intricately connected the olfactory system is to memory and emotion and drives. People often report, and the research supports, that smells can be more emotionally evocative and better cues for memory than other types of sensory input. So there's something about smelling something that has the ability to take us back in time and evoke these strong emotions that's very different from seeing pictures or hearing things. The first person to write about this that we know of was Marcel Proust. I'll give you a minute to read the quote. He describes the process of eating a tea-soaked cookie and being transported back in time to his childhood and experiencing the same flavor. So there are certain scents that, for many of us, lead to these involuntary and highly emotionally evocative autobiographical experiences. For me, I smell Bath & Body Works sun-ripened raspberry lotion, and I'm just like back in high school in the locker room after a volleyball game, just that incredibly strong emotional sense. So people report these odor-evoked memories as being more emotionally evocative than memories that are induced by other senses. And these intuitions that we have, these experiences, have been borne out in research as well. So I'll just tell you about one study that's demonstrated kind of the emotional connection that smell has, but there are many others like this. In one study, participants were recruited about 2 months before they were tested. They were called on the phone and asked to identify a perfume whose sight and scent elicits a specific and pleasant personal memory that's associated with a particular place or event. So for instance, one person said, I remember a trip to Paris when I was in 4th grade and me sitting and watching my mother while she was getting ready to go out and the Chanel No. 5 perfume that she used, which was sitting on her vanity. Okay, then a couple months later, participants come into the lab. They're put into an fMRI so the researchers can scan brain activity, and they're administered either the scent of the perfume. So they have this device that, is like a long tube connected to a bottle of Chanel No. 5, and they can give a little squirt right by the participant's nose. So they're either given the scent or they're shown an image in the scanner of the bottle of perfume. And they were asked whether or not the stimulus evokes a memory, and if it did, to be thinking about that memory during the experiment. So they evaluated both the activity in the brain, in the amygdala specifically, and they also had participants rate the emotional intensity of the memory. The results showed that not only were the olfactory generated memories rated as more emotionally evocative, but they also generated significantly more amygdala activity than the visually presented ones. So the subjective experience of emotional potency of odor-evoked memory is correlated with specific activation in the amygdala during recall. So why is smell so emotionally evocative? Why is it the case that we have projections directly from to amygdala and entorhinal cortex in the olfactory system, but not in the auditory system? Like, why is smell wired that way? The most compelling explanation that I've heard about that is that smell is evolutionarily very old. It's the sense that developed earliest in evolutionary history. It's our most basic survival kind of like reptile sense. So senses that came along later evolved these more complex, higher order brain structures, but the pathways for smell were developed early. That groundwork was laid early enough that they remain linked to other abilities that are important for survival, like finding good food sources, avoiding danger, and evaluating mates. I mentioned last time that if people are asked which sensory system they'd most readily give up, people reliably say smell. But perhaps because of the emotional ties to smell, complete or physical anosmia can have very negative consequences. I mentioned last time that if people are asked which sensory system they'd most readily give up, most people say smell. But perhaps because of the strong emotional connections tied to smell, complete or physical anosmia can have really negative consequences. People with anosmia are more likely than people without to suffer from a range of conditions, including depression and anxiety. They also face a number of specific challenges. First, smell alerts us to lots of dangers in the environment. In the case of gas leaks and fires, people typically first detect and avoid them by smelling something. Similarly, a lot of our experience with avoiding spoiled food is the distinctive smell, right? You open a container of something and before you even get it up to your mouth, that gross smell hits you and you don't actually have to eat it. Also, people with anosmia report little to no enjoyment from food. Most of our experience with flavor comes from smell. So people describe eating food that just feels like cardboard in their mouths. Think of how boring it is to eat with a cold, right? Anosmia is like that, but much more intense and permanent. In addition, people with anosmia report less emotional connection to other people and less strong emotional experience overall. One anosmic said, "The world now seems flat and dull, as if drained of color." When I smell the back of my baby's necks or like put on my husband's sweatshirt after he's worn it, those are really good emotional feelings, right? Those make you feel cozy and connected to your loved ones. So not having that is something that anosmics report being a real difficulty for them. Another challenge is that anosmia is an invisible disability. People regularly forget that you have it. You have to keep reminding people. There are no hearing aids, there are no seeing eye dogs, and the public generally underappreciates how devastating a disability it can be. Anosmia may be the only kind of sensory loss that is regularly met by reactions like, "Oh boy, lucky for you, I wish I didn't have to smell stinky stuff anymore." Right? So anosmics report that in addition to this being a difficult sensory loss, it's also really hard that it's so poorly understood by other people. We each walk in our own perceptual world, and it's hard for those of us who have an intact sense of smell to appreciate how difficult it would be to not have one. Now I want you to hear from a few people with anosmia about the experience in their own words. Some of these people have congenital anosmia, meaning they have never had a working sense of smell. Other people have acquired anosmia, meaning it occurred as the result of some kind of damage to the olfactory system.
I wish I had more of these dreams. I had one dream. I woke up so happy. It was so real. I remember being in the kitchen, and all of a sudden I smelled broccoli that I took out of the fridge. It was just so real, and when I woke up, I was happy.
My friends would say things like we'd be near a movie theater, and they would say, "I smell popcorn." And I actually had no idea that what they were saying related to something they were taking in through their senses from the environment.
My father can't smell, I have an uncle who can't smell, my grandfather can't smell. I just sort of assumed that I would not have a sense of smell. My earliest memories are my mother sitting down with me with scratch and sniff books, and I always just remember thinking, okay, everything just smells the same.
As I was working in the kitchen, everything was about smell. It was the smell of veal stock bubbling on the stove. It was the smell of butter melting in the pan. Smell gave flavor to all of the different ingredients I was working with. Without a sense of smell, eating for me became like my world had faded from color to black and white.
I just remember waking up in the hospital with needles in my arms. So what's going on? And they told me you got hit by a car. I went online, started searching, loss of smell, head injury. Is this such a thing? I didn't even know it existed.
My life is totally different now.
There are things that people
just can't describe to you.
I'd really love to know, what my wife smells like, what my son smells like. I think he smells sweet and, like a kid. I wish I knew.
There's this new car smell that everyone talks about, and they can't describe it.
My baby, I like to smell my baby. I hear new babies smell really nice.
Barbecue, the grass.
People will come into my room and they'll say, oh, this smells just like you, and I don't really get that.
I've heard people say it smells like it's gonna rain. I can't understand how it can smell like the weather.
Wintertime was always the fireplaces on my block back home. Was always a good smell growing up as a kid. I know the summer's gonna come up and there's gonna be barbecues. That's something I'm gonna miss too. Just good times I linked with certain smells.
I want to smell like a woman. It's just missing. And I do isolate a lot more now because I feel safer just being with myself.
Smell is linked to some of the most important parts of our lives. It's linked to our memories, it's linked to our childhood, it's linked to our past. It says a lot about what we eat, how we choose to eat, where we like to go, what we like to put on our skin. It brings us closer to people. It makes us recognize the people that we love. It's complicated, and it's not completely understood by the scientific community. But we do know that it begins with a molecule, and there are many different stops and signals along the way.
You've heard about some ways that vision affects flavor identification, but vision can affect olfactory identification as well. So in this study, participants were given vials that had a strawberry scented liquid in it. The vials were either red or clear or green, and participants were asked to smell the vial and then identify what the scent was. So sometimes people would say, oh, strawberry, get it right. Sometimes they'd say, raspberry, grape, get it wrong. So participants had the highest accuracy when the color of the vial matched our typical, matched how we typically experience strawberry things as being red. So it suggests that the visual system is affecting odor identification. We have better identification of odors when they are appropriately colored based on our previous expectations. Similarly, if participants are given odorless vials of a liquid, but told that on some trials one of the vials will contain an odor, they are more likely to report that the red colored liquid has an odor than the clear one. So even though neither vial has any odor in it, they're more likely to have a false alarm or be biased to an odor when the liquid is colored. So both of these findings are consistent with the idea that we rely on previously learned multisensory associations to make predictions. It's more rare for red stuff to be unscented than for clear stuff to be unscented. Therefore, we're biased to expect that colored substances have an odor. So it nicely demonstrates no sense is an island. You read about studies in which participants' expectations about a substance affected how they evaluate that substance. Anytime we can present the exact same bottom-up stimuli to different groups of participants and have them experience it differently because of something we tell them about it, that is like beautiful top-down action at work. That is like the stuff of perceptual psychologists' dreams. I can make you experience it differently just by telling you something about it. I love this. Okay. In one such study, researchers cooked up a blend of a particular odor that contained elements of both sweat and cheddar cheese. They presented it to participants labeled as either being cheddar cheese or body odor. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they found that participants generated higher pleasantness ratings for the cheddar cheese smell than the body odor smell. But wait, there's more. They also monitored neural activity using an fMRI and looked particularly at activity in orbitofrontal cortex, so orbitofrontal cortex associated with the affective interpretation of these scents. And this is what they found. There was greater activity in orbitofrontal cortex when the participants were smelling that delightful bouquet and told that it was cheddar cheese than when they were interpreting it as an unpleasant body odor scent. So even though the stimulus is exactly the same, it's sweat and cheese no matter what, depending on their expectations of it, they both subjectively enjoyed it more and showed greater activity in regions of cortex that code for affective evaluation when it had a pleasant label than an unpleasant one. Who thinks perception is an inference, right? This is clearly, we are experiencing this, we're experiencing these stimuli very differently depending on our expectations, meaning they are not solely a function of the bottom-up input. In the gustation unit, I was very firm that we differentiate between taste and flavor. I don't want you to say, I'm eating this orange and it tastes so delicious and orangey, because orange is a scent and not a taste. One of the reasons that I really want to emphasize this is that I want everyone who has taken this class to appreciate smell more than they did before they started the class. So with this in mind, we're going to do, and I want you to be thinking about the way that smell is underappreciated and presenting the information that you have learned in a way to help other people around you, whoever you're sharing your house or your dorm with right now, appreciate smell as well. We'll wrap up with that. Have fun on the problem set. Taste and smell are both chemical senses. And in both, there's not a one-to-one relationship between stimulus and receptor. That is, each type of receptor responds to multiple different types of odorants or tastants. We talked about those gustatory receptor cells, that a sweet-tuned receptor cell may still fire somewhat to a sour tastant. In the olfactory system, each type of receptor may respond to multiple different types of odorants. Relatedly, both use population coding. So the overall sensory quality is determined by the simultaneous activity of all of the different receptor types. What's different is that in the gustatory system, we can code for as many different tastes as we have types of receptors, right? We have 5 basic classes of receptors: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, umami, and we can taste 5 different things. Whereas in the olfactory system, we can code for many, many more odors than we have olfactory receptor types, right? We have something like 350 functional olfactory receptor neuron types, but we can smell thousands, maybe even millions of different odors. There are also substantially more individual differences in olfactory processing. So we differ markedly in which types of olfactory receptor neurons are active, leading to larger individual differences in perception for the olfactory system than for the gustatory system. Can you believe this? So this study relies on the fact that olfactory processing is ipsilateral. And so even though information that makes it to the left hemisphere of the brain can travel to the right hemisphere of the brain via the corpus callosum, the experience in the left hemisphere, because it is kind of the first relay, is stronger, is more intense. So the researchers found, as predicted, that the shorter distance between nostril and cortex affected both naming accuracy and pleasantness rating. Yet another way that having 2 nostrils matters.